Hello, my curious friend, and a very warm welcome to Deepfield Channel. Tonight, we are going to delve into one of the closest yet most baffling mysteries the human mind has ever attempted to unravel. The question of whether your choices are truly your own or if your brain has already made them for you before you even realize it. It is a topic that rests right on the strange boundary between hard science and what we feel to be true about ourselves, and I promise to try and keep it from being so unsettling that it chases away the sleep you deserve tonight. But before we dive into this mystery, I would love to know in the comments which corner of the world you are listening from right now. And if you are feeling too lazy to type, just leave a simple hello. It might seem like a small thing, but that tiny gesture shows YouTube that our space is welcoming and helps us bring more tired minds here to relax with us. If you enjoy our scientific journeys, please leave a like and subscribe. And to those of you who are already part of our community, thank you so much. If you want to feel even closer to the channel, consider becoming a member. Members get early access to our videos before anyone else. The link is right there in the description. Now, wherever you happen to be, find a truly comfortable position. If sleep comes, just accept the invitation. Let us begin. There is a moment you have lived through countless times. You are faced with something simple, a cup of tea or coffee, two different routes to the exact same destination, a word on the tip of your tongue waiting to be spoken or swallowed, and then something happens inside you, something that feels as natural as breathing, and you choose. You feel that you chose. You feel that it was you, with your entire will, who moved your arm, who turned left, who spoke up or stayed silent. This sensation is so constant, so intimate that we rarely stop to examine it. It is simply there, like the ground beneath your feet, assumed, invisible, and absolutely unquestionable. But what if that sensation were, to some extent, just a story your brain tells itself after everything has already been decided? This is not a question meant to cause you distress. It is a question that neuroscience has begun to ask with absolute seriousness over the last few decades, and the answers it has found are both disorienting and profoundly fascinating. They do not destroy who you are, but they do gently and precisely alter the way you understand the stage upon which your life unfolds. Start with a simple image. Have you ever watched a movie and been moved to tears by a scene you knew was entirely fictional? Your heart raced, perhaps your eyes grew wet, even though your full intelligence knew those people did not exist, and that situation never actually occurred. Your brain created a genuine emotional response out of pure representation. It did not wait for your approval, it simply felt. And you, the conscious spectator who knew it was fiction, arrived a little later, merely observing the aftermath of a reaction that was already well underway. Free will might operate in a curiously similar fashion. The notion that we are the conscious authors of our actions is perhaps the most central belief underlying everything we consider human identity. It supports entire systems, the morality that governs our relationships, the justice that organizes our societies, the responsibility that gives meaning to our triumphs and our mistakes. To suggest that this idea might be an illusion sounds, at first, hearing like a threat. It feels as though someone is trying to pull the very ground out from under your feet. But neuroscience is not saying that, or at least, it is not only saying that. What it is saying is far more subtle and in a way much more beautiful. It is suggesting that the process we call choice is deeper, richer, and older than the thin layer of consciousness we usually refer to as the self. And understanding this process does not diminish you. It transforms how you relate to your own mind. To enter this territory, we first need to understand the stage where all of this takes place. The human brain is an organ that fits in the palms of your cupped hands and weighs roughly 1.3 kilograms. It is a gelatinous structure, with an external appearance of a wrinkled, moist surface, formed by folds and grooves that exist precisely because evolution had to pack a massive processing area into a skull of limited size. If you could completely unfold the cerebral cortex of an adult human, that outer layer covering the brain like a thinking shell, it would occupy a surface area comparable to a large sheet of newspaper, all packed inside a skull, folded over itself dozens of times. And within that structure there are approximately 86 billion neurons. 86 billion! To give that number some meaning, think of it this way. If you decided to count 1 neuron per second without stopping, without sleeping, without eating, it would take you over 2,700 years to finish. There are more neurons in your brain than there are stars visible to the naked eye in the night sky. There are more connections between these neurons, called synapses, than there have been seconds since the Big Bang. And every single one of those connections is active. It is doing something. Right now. As you listen to these words, an unimaginable amount of electrical and chemical activity is occurring in different layers and structures of your brain simultaneously. There are regions processing sound, others assigning meaning to the words, others maintaining your posture, regulating your breathing, monitoring your body temperature, checking memories associated with the concepts arising, and managing your heart rate. All of this at once, in parallel, without any conscious effort on your part. You did not decide to understand this sentence, you simply understood it. And this is where the first great surprise regarding free will begins to emerge. Consciousness, that sensation of being an I that observes, decides, and acts, is not the totality of who you are. In terms of neural processing, it is a relatively small fraction of everything your brain does every instant. The vast majority of brain work is unconscious, automatic, and invisible to the internal observer you call yourself. Think about learning to drive. In the beginning, you had to consciously think about every single movement, where to put your feet, when to turn the wheel, how to gauge the distance to other cars. It was exhausting precisely because it was conscious. Over time, those movements sank into deeper layers of the nervous system, became automatic, and now you drive while thinking about something entirely different. Who is driving at that moment? It is not your conscious I, it is something older, faster, and more efficient. The exact same principle applies to language, facial recognition, maintaining your balance while walking, and interpreting the emotional expressions of the people around you. All of this happens before and beneath consciousness. But the popular myth about free will assumes that choices are different. It assumes that when it comes to decisions, especially the ones that seem important, the ones involving values, intentions, and desires, consciousness takes the wheel, that it is the deliberative I who pulls the trigger. Neuroscience has spent decades investigating exactly that assumption, and what it found was, for many researchers, one of the most unsettling discoveries in the history of the science of the human mind. The starting point for this investigation was an experiment that is now famous and needs to be presented carefully because it is frequently misunderstood. In the 1980s, a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet conducted a series of experiments that became the benchmark for all discussions on free will and neuroscience. What he did was seemingly simple. He asked participants to flick their wrists whenever they felt the urge, while watching a dot spin on a circular clock and noting the position of the dot at the exact moment they felt the conscious urge to move. At the same time, electrodes measured the electrical activity in their brains. What Libet found shook decades of philosophical assumptions. He observed that there was an electrical signal in the participants' brains, called the readiness potential, that consistently appeared before the people reported having the intention to move. The brain was preparing for the action before the conscious mind reported wanting to act. On average, this neural preparation preceded the conscious awareness of the intention by a fraction of a second, which, in the context of how the brain operates, is a considerable window of time. The immediate interpretation many made was dramatic. If the brain has already prepared before you are consciously aware of wanting to move, then who really decided? The decision was already happening without you. But that interpretation needs to be unpacked with much greater care, because Libet's experiment is real and important, but the conclusions drawn from it reveal just as much about how we think as they do about what the experiment actually measured. To begin with, there is a fundamental distinction that is often ignored in popular versions of this story. the difference between preparing for an action and deciding upon that action. The readiness potential might reflect a process of neural accumulation, a sort of growing tension like a spring being slowly compressed, without implying that the decision is already made. Consciousness in this reading might still have a role, not the role of initiating the movement from scratch, but perhaps the role of vetoing, breaking, permitting, or directing. And there is something even more fundamental that must be said about the brain's structure before we can truly grasp what is at stake in this conversation. The brain is not a unitary machine with a single command center. It is a collection of systems that evolved at different points in the history of life, stacked upon one another like geological layers of time. There are very ancient structures, the brainstem, the cerebellum, the limbic system, that manage basic survival functions, emotion, and memory. There are newer structures like the prefrontal cortex, which appear to be the neural substrate for deliberative reasoning, planning, evaluating consequences, and inhibiting impulses. These layers do not work in an orderly sequence, like floors in a building where a message travels from the bottom to the top until it reaches the director's office. They work in parallel in constant dialogue, sometimes in harmony and sometimes in tension. What we call a decision might be the emergent result of this dialogue, something that no individual part of the brain produced alone, but that arose from the collective whole. Imagine an orchestra playing a symphony. No single instrument is the music. The music is what emerges when everyone plays together, in relation to one another, responding and influencing. Now imagine trying to identify which instrument made the decision to play that specific note at that exact moment. The question begins to lose its meaning when you realize the note arose from the relationship between them all. It may be that consciousness within this system functions in a similar way, not as the isolated conductor giving all the orders, but as something that emerges from the process, a perspective that forms from the activity of the whole, capable of observing, integrating, and crucially modifying what is happening. And if that is the case, a question arises that hangs like mist over still water, one that cannot be answered hastily, one that demands we descend deeper into this unexplored territory. Where does the energy, the invisible raw material, that fuels this entire processing system come from before any conscious thought even forms? The question left hanging in the air was not rhetorical. It was a genuine opening, a fissure we need to descend into. Because before any decision, before any impulse we call will, there is something that makes it all possible. An economy, a flow, an invisible currency being spent every instant inside the skull. Think of a city at 3 a.m. The streets seem empty, but the systems keep running. Water circulates in the pipes. Electricity runs through the wires. Traffic lights blink for no one. The city isn't truly asleep. It merely changes its rhythm, redistributes its resources, and keeps the infrastructure ready for dawn. The brain works exactly like this. While you sleep, while you're not thinking about anything apparent, the machinery continues, and it consumes a surprising amount of energy to do so. The human brain accounts for roughly 2% of your total body mass, yet it consumes about 20% of all the energy your body generates at rest. This is disproportionate in a way that should make us pause. No other organ does this. The heart, working tirelessly, pumping blood for decades without stopping, consumes a fraction of that percentage relative to its size. Why would such a small organ require so much? The answer begins to reveal something fundamental about the nature of what we call free choice. The brain's currency is called adenosine triphosphate. A molecule biologists abbreviate as ATP, but the technical name doesn't yet carry the weight of what it represents. Imagine that every neuron is a flashlight. To shine, to fire a signal, to communicate something to the neighbouring neuron, that flashlight needs a battery. ATP is that battery. And batteries run out. They need to be recharged constantly in real time while thinking is happening. What this means is that thinking is not free. Deciding is not free. Every fragment of processing has a real, measurable energetic cost that affects what the brain can or cannot do next. This detail changes everything when we think about free will, because if the capacity to deliberate, to weigh options, to exercise what we feel as conscious control has an energetic cost, then the nervous system inevitably develops shortcuts. It develops paths of least resistance. It develops patterns that do not need to be recalculated from scratch every time a similar situation appears. And these patterns, these shortcuts, begin to operate below the threshold of consciousness, precisely because they are energetically cheaper. Neuroscientist Roy Baumeister spent decades investigating what he called ego depletion, the observation that the capacity to exert control over behaviours seems to diminish after periods of intense use. In experiments conducted in the 1980s and 90s, people who first resisted the temptation to eat chocolate cookies ended up persisting for less time on a subsequent frustrating task than those who hadn't had to resist anything. It was as if the decision-making muscle had been partially fatigued. The controversy surrounding these experiments is real, and the replication of results has sparked heated scientific debates, but the underlying principle remains biologically plausible. Systems that consume energy have limits, and those limits shape behaviour in ways that are not consciously chosen. To understand where this energy goes, we need to zoom in to the level of a single nerve cell. The neuron at rest maintains a difference in electrical charge between its inside and its outside. The inside is more negative, the outside is more positive. Maintaining this balance requires constant work, much like keeping a room cool in the summer requires the air conditioner to run non-stop. There are molecular pumps in the neuron's membrane that push sodium ions out and bring potassium ions in tirelessly, spending ATP with every cycle. This is the resting state. And when the neuron fires a signal, when it communicates, the process momentarily reverses. Ions rush across the membrane, and the pump has to work even harder to restore the balance. Every single firing has a cost. Every thought is made of thousands of firings. Every conscious second is a storm of microscopic energetic transactions. The story of how we came to understand this begins with two men on an English beach studying squid. Alan Hodgkin and Andrew Huxley, in the 1940s, chose to work with the giant squid axon because it was large enough to insert an electrode inside the cell and measure what was happening. This was impossible in human neurons at the time, which were too small for any available instrument. Squids, unexpectedly, became the window through which humanity looked into the very electrical workings of the nervous system. What Hodgkin and Huxley measured and later mathematized was the action potential, the electrical wave that travels down the neuron when it fires. They described the equations governing this process, equations that still form the foundation of computational neuroscience today. And for this work in 1963, they received the Nobel Prize. But what matters here is not the prestige of the award. What matters is that they revealed a law. The law Hodgkin and Huxley described has a simple name: all or none. The neuron does not fire partially. There is no weak firing or strong firing depending on the importance of the stimulus. When the stimulus reaches a specific threshold, the neuron fires with its full possible intensity. When the stimulus falls below that threshold, the neuron does not fire at all. It is a binary law in a system that produces all the richness and nuance of human experience. Think about what this implies for free will. The decision, at some fundamental level, is not a matter of degrees. It is a matter of thresholds, of what arrives, when it arrives, with what accumulated intensity, until the system crosses a point of no return and fires. This threshold nature creates a fundamental asymmetry, an imbalance that is precisely what makes the system work. Before the threshold, nothing. After the threshold, everything. And the exact moment the threshold is crossed depends on the sum of all signals arriving at the neuron at that instant. Some signals are excitatory, pushing the neuron toward firing. Others are inhibitory, pulling the neuron away from firing. The neuron is constantly integrating, adding and subtracting, weighing the input from dozens or hundreds of other neurons simultaneously. And when the sum crosses the threshold, the decision is made, not by a central agent, by the arithmetic of connections. Now imagine that this arithmetic is not random, that the connections between neurons have been shaped by every experience you have ever had, by every repeated pattern, by every emotion that left a chemical trace in the synapses. The brain learns by changing the strength of the connections between neurons. A neuron that fires repeatedly alongside another strengthens the synapse linking them. A pattern that happens many times becomes easier to activate the next time because the effective threshold drops. This is what Canadian neuroscientist Donald Hebb described in 1949 with a phrase that became famous: neurons that fire together, wire together. Hebb's law is not poetry. It is a description of how the past literally sculpts the future of the nervous system. What does this do to the idea that our decisions are free? Every choice you make today alters, in a microscopic but real degree, the probability of tomorrow's choices. Not in an absolutely deterministic way, because the system is complex and influenced by countless variables, but in a statistically measurable way. The person who chose to walk instead of taking the bus 200 times has a different nervous system than the person who never did. Not just in their muscles, in the very tissue of the neural processing that precedes any conscious decision about whether or not to walk today. The story that brought us to this understanding also passed through Santiago Ramón y Cajal, a 19th century Spaniard who was the son of a doctor and grew up dreaming of being an artist. He ended up being both. Cajal developed staining techniques that allowed, for the first time, individual neurons to be seen clearly under a microscope. What he saw changed biology. Before Cajal, there was a genuine debate over whether the nervous system was made of individual cells or a continuous network, a reticulum without borders. Cajal demonstrated they were distinct cells, separated by tiny gaps, which would later be named synapses. For this work, in 1906, he shared the Nobel Prize with Camillo Golgi, whose staining methods Cajal had used and improved, in a ceremony that became famous because Golgi used his acceptance speech to publicly attack Cajal's conclusions. Science is rarely a clean narrative of linear progress. It is a territory of disputes, egos, and painful revisions. But Cajal's legacy is that we see the nervous system for what it is, an architecture of distinct cells communicating across real physical spaces where chemical messengers called neurotransmitters must cross the synapse, fit into specific receptors, and either produce or suppress the next firing. These neurotransmitters are the language of the brain, and like any language, they can be altered by drugs, by experiences, by emotional states, by the time of day, by blood sugar levels. The message arriving at a neuron at 7 in the morning after a good night's sleep is not the same message that arrives after 30 hours without sleep, even if the external stimulus is identical. This reveals the deepest imbalance at the heart of the system. The brain is not processing the world. It is processing a version of the world filtered by its current internal state, and the current internal state is the product of everything that came before: genetic history, accumulated experiences, fatigue levels, mood, the neurotransmitters circulating at that exact moment. The famous objectivity of rational decision-making, when looked at closely, dissolves into a series of contextual dependencies that the deciding subject rarely knows and almost never consciously controls. Charles Sherrington, another giant of early 20th century neuroscience, described the nervous system as an enchanted loom, where millions of glowing threads weave patterns that are always fleeting yet always meaningful, a pattern that is never permanent. This image captures something that scientific language often fails to: the dynamic, fluid, never the same character of a system that processes and is modified by the processing simultaneously. And it is in this modification that lies the local mechanism we need to observe carefully. In a single moment, at a single synapse, something happens, a signal arrives, a neurotransmitter is released, a receptor is activated, an action potential either happens or it doesn't. This tiny, invisible event lasts milliseconds. It has no drama. It has no meaning in itself. It is just physics and chemistry following their laws. But this event slightly alters the probability of the next similar event at that same synapse, and that next event alters the probability of the one after, and so on in a cascade of influences that accumulate silently, below any consciousness, below any sensation of deliberation or choice. What happens when this mechanism, this microscopic adjustment of synaptic probabilities, repeats millions of times a day, for months, for years, silently shaping the patterns that precede every thought you believe you chose to have? When a microscopic adjustment of probabilities repeats millions of times, something begins to happen that was not contained in any individual synapse, in any isolated neuron, in any specific chemical exchange. Something begins to happen that cannot be found in the parts, but that emerges from the relationship between them. Science has a name for this phenomenon, but the name hardly does justice to the strangeness of what it describes: emergence. The order that no component planned, the structure that no one built, the pattern that appears because the pieces communicate according to simple rules repeated countless times. The human brain contains roughly 100 billion neurons. Each of them can be connected to tens of thousands of others. The number of possible synaptic connections within a single human skull surpasses by orders of magnitude the estimated number of stars in the Milky Way. When you try to imagine this scale, the mind slips because we have no references for it. We grow up with countable objects, with landscapes that fit in our visual field, with social networks of dozens or hundreds of people. The architecture of our own brain is literally incomprehensible to the brain trying to comprehend it, and it is within this vastness that emergent patterns organize themselves, not because someone planned them, not because there is some central ordering principle, but because the physics of large-scale interactions creates its own logic. The first major pattern neuroscientists learned to observe was not in any specific cell, it was in the collective electricity of the entire organ. When Hans Berger in the early 20th century placed electrodes on the scalps of patients and recorded the oscillations of the brain's electric field, he was seeing for the first time something that had always been there. The brain thinks in rhythms. Not in isolated events, not in scattered sparks unrelated to one another, but in waves that propagate, that synchronize, that compete and cooperate at different frequencies simultaneously. Berger was disturbed by what he discovered. He expected noise, he expected chaos, he expected perhaps some vague electrical signature of mental activity. What he found were organized oscillations, patterns that changed according to the person's state, their level of attention, the presence or absence of external stimuli. These brain waves, which we now call alpha, beta, delta, theta, and gamma, are not generated by any particular neuron. They are properties of the collective system. They arise because entire populations of neurons synchronize with each other, like pendulums that start out of phase and gradually, through mutual influences, end up oscillating together. It is the same phenomenon that causes fireflies in certain parts of Asia to flash in perfect synchrony, without any leader, without any central coordinating signal. The synchrony emerges from the very dynamics of local interactions propagating through the network. What Berger did not know, and what decades of subsequent neuroscience have slowly been revealing, is that these oscillations are not just passive epiphenomena of brain activity. They are part of the mechanism by which the brain organizes information processing. When one region of the brain needs to communicate efficiently with another, the two populations of neurons tend to synchronize their oscillations. Synchrony creates windows of opportunity for signals from one region to arrive at the correct phase of the other region's cycles, maximizing transmission efficacy. Desynchronization acts as noise that hinders communication. In this sense, brain rhythms are something like communication protocols the system spontaneously developed over evolution without any engineer designing them. There is a pattern that researchers like Francisco Varela and colleagues investigated with particular attention. Synchronization in the gamma frequency range, which oscillates at around 40 cycles per second. When you perceive something as a unified object, when you recognize a face or understand a sentence, distributed brain regions processing different aspects of that experience, color, shape, movement, meaning, briefly synchronize in this range. Varela proposed that this transient synchronization was the mechanism by which the brain solved what he called the binding problem, the problem of how fragments of information processed in parallel in different regions are integrated into a coherent perceptual experience. No central region receives all the data and binds it. The unity emerges from distributed synchronization. The whole forms without there being a place where the whole resides. But there is a second level of large-scale organization that modern neuroscience has identified, and it has even deeper implications for the question of where decisions form. It is what neuroscientists call resting state networks, or more specifically, the default mode network. For decades, researchers scanned brains while participants performed cognitive tasks and mapped which regions activated. The implicit assumption was that the resting state, when the person is not doing anything in particular, was a neutral state, a sort of silence from which meaningful activity would emerge when needed. Marcus Rachel and his colleagues, at the turn of the 21st century, were examining neuroimaging data when they noticed something that completely contradicted this assumption. When people were not doing anything specific, certain brain regions did not stay quiet. They became more active than during any external task. The default mode network, distributed across the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the precuneus, and other regions, consumes energy intensely precisely when there is no external demand. It is the network of mental wandering, of rumination, of planning the imagined future, of narrating yourself to yourself. It is the network that tells the story of who you are while no urgent task occupies your time. And it is a large-scale organizational network whose activity patterns are not localized in any specific point, but are distributed in configurations that vary from person to person and remain surprisingly stable over time as a kind of individual neural signature. What does this pattern have to do with free will and decisions? Everything from the perspective of several neuroscientists studying the topic. The default mode network does not sit idle while you consciously deliberate over a choice. It is active in the moments preceding deliberation, building the context within which the deliberation will occur. It keeps active representations of your long-term goals, your fears, your hopes, your identity narrative. When you face a decision, you do not face it as a blank slate examining options with fresh eyes. You face it as a system that already has configured in its distributed networks an entire set of biases, predispositions, and evaluations built over your whole history. Conscious deliberation happens within a space that has already been partially defined before any conscious deliberation began. There is a geometry to this large-scale organization that neuroscientists are still learning to read. The brain is not homogeneous. It has a pole-to-pole structure, from the frontal to the occipital region, that reflects a hierarchy of abstraction in information processing. Posterior regions tend to process more sensory, more concrete, more immediate information. Anterior regions tend to deal with more abstract representations, with extended temporal planning, with the integration of information over time. This gradient of abstraction running from the back to the front of the brain, means that the patterns preceding a complex decision have a characteristic geometry. They begin in posterior regions processing the current state of the world and the body, and progressively integrate in anterior regions where future options are simulated and evaluated. There is also an asymmetry between the hemispheres that influences how patterns organize. The left hemisphere tends to specialize in sequential processing, in language, in detailed step-by-step analysis. The right hemisphere tends to process more holistically, recognizing global patterns, integrating broad context. When you experience having made a decision and can articulate the reasons for it in language, you're predominantly using the left hemisphere. But neuroimaging analyses show that the activity patterns preceding the decision often include processes distributed across both hemispheres. with the right hemisphere contributing contextual evaluations that may never become conscious or verbalizable. Michael Gazzaniga, who spent decades studying patients with a severed corpus callosum, that bundle of fibers connecting the two hemispheres, discovered something fascinating about this asymmetry. In patients where direct communication between the two hemispheres was surgically interrupted, it is possible to show information to the right hemisphere without the left having access to it. When the right hemisphere guides an action based on this hidden information and the left hemisphere is asked why it performed the action, the left hemisphere does not say it doesn't know. It invents an explanation. It confabulates. Gazzaniga called the system that does this the interpreter, and proposed that this left hemisphere interpreter is what creates the narrative of personal causality we call free will. The system that tells the story of why you did what you did is not necessarily the system that generated the action. This dissociation between the generator of the action and the narrator of the action is one of the most unsettling large-scale patterns neuroscience has identified. Because if the narrator can invent plausible reasons for actions whose real reasons are inaccessible to it, then the experience of having consciously deliberated and chosen for such and such reasons might be partially a retrospective construction. The sensation of having weighed options, of having considered consequences, of having decided for reasons you recognize as your own, might be in part a story the brain tells itself after the fact, a story that fits what happened but does not accurately describe the process that led to that event. This does not mean conscious deliberation is completely irrelevant or pure fiction. It means it is just one part of a much larger process, occurring on many scales simultaneously, from the individual synaptic adjustment to the global patterns of distributed networks, and that the layer with access to consciousness is just one of those scales, not necessarily the most determining one in all situations. The large-scale patterns preceding a decision reflect the entire learning history of the system, its entire architecture built over development, the entire configuration of its network shaped by countless accumulated experiences. And here we reach a point where we must pause and recognize that these patterns, for all their complexity and the elegance of the emergent structures they exhibit, would still be relatively ordered systems if they remained operating in a simpler state. There would be oscillations, there would be distributed networks, there would be the geometry of the abstraction gradient and hemispheric asymmetry. But the state space the system explored would be more limited, the variations more predictable, the patterns more stable and repetitive. What transforms these patterns into something radically richer, radically less predictable, radically more sensitive to microscopic initial conditions, is the presence of an ingredient not found in simpler systems, an ingredient that amplifies small variations rather than smoothing them out, that pushes the system away from stable equilibria rather than keeping it in them, that causes the space of possibilities to be explored in a way no external observer could fully anticipate. The ingredient is noise, not noise in the colloquial sense of something inconvenient, of a disturbing sound, of unwanted interference to be eliminated. The noise we're talking about here is a technical concept with implications that completely change how we understand the brain's functioning, and therefore how we understand what it means to make a decision. Noise, in the context of computational neuroscience, refers to the intrinsic stochastic variability of neural systems, the random fluctuation that exists at all levels of biological processing, from the opening of a single ion channel in a neuron's membrane to the large-scale oscillations sweeping across entire cortical regions. It is omnipresent, it is inevitable, and for a long time it was treated as a problem to be fixed, as an imperfection of the biological substrate making the brain less precise than desirable. That perspective was profoundly mistaken. What decades of research in computational neuroscience have revealed is that neural noise is not a flaw in the system. It is one of its most functional features. And when you understand why this is true, the question of free will begins to take on contours that were not anticipated by the philosophers who first formulated the problem. To understand why noise amplifies neural behavior in such profound ways, we must start with something very simple: a neuron fires an action potential when the sum of its inputs exceeds a certain threshold. Below the threshold, silence. Above it, firing. This seems like a simple, almost mechanical mechanism, but the threshold is not a rigid boundary. It is a zone, and what determines whether a particular input will or will not cross that zone depends on the noise state of the system at that exact instant. Microscopic fluctuations in ion concentration, variations in the conductance of membrane channels that open and close probabilistically, thermal interference in the molecular processes supporting synaptic transmission. All this means the same signal, applied to the same neuron at two different times, can produce different responses. And this difference is not just possible in theory, it is measurable, it is reproducible in the lab, and it is fundamental to the functioning of the system as a whole. The phenomenon has a name: stochastic resonance. The name comes from the physics of nonlinear systems, and its history is curious. In the 1980s, three physicists, Giorgio Benzi, Alfonso Sutera, and Alfonso Vulpiani, were trying to understand the oscillations of ice ages in Earth's climate history. The problem they faced was that the astronomical signal responsible for these oscillations, the variations in Earth's orbit and axial tilt over cycles of roughly 100,000 years, was too weak to alone explain the abrupt transitions between warm and cold periods shown by geological data. The solution they found was counterintuitive. Random climatic noise, instead of hindering the detection of the weak signal, actually amplified it. There was an optimal amount of noise that maximized the system's ability to respond to the periodic signal. This phenomenon was named stochastic resonance, and when researchers began studying neural systems, they discovered the same principle applied in extraordinary ways. Sensory neurons operate in a carefully calibrated noise regime. The intrinsic noise of the system allows subliminal signals, signals that would be too weak to cross the threshold on their own, to become detectable when the right amount of noise is added. The word right here is essential. Too little noise, and the system remains insensitive to weak signals. Too much noise, and the signal is completely lost in the interference. The right amount of noise causes the system's random fluctuations to sometimes push the weak signal above the threshold, allowing it to be detected, while the frequency with which this happens still carries information about the original signal's intensity. The biological system does not just tolerate noise, it uses it. This has direct consequences for perception and decision-making. Psychophysics studies show that humans detect very weak sensory stimuli with greater precision when a small amount of random noise is present along with the stimulus. This effect has been demonstrated in various domains, in detecting subtle tactile vibrations, in perceiving sounds near the auditory threshold, in discriminating very low visual contrasts. The noise the nervous system itself generates, instead of degrading perception, sharpens it. And this is not just a passive effect. The auditory cortex, the visual cortex, the somatosensory cortex, all these systems actively regulate their own noise levels, adjusting excitability parameters to keep the system at an optimal operating point, close to what engineers would call the margin of stability. But stochastic resonance is just the beginning. Noise does something even more radical when considering the behavior of the system as a whole, and not just individual neurons or specific sensory areas. Neural networks operating near what physicists call phase transitions, bifurcation points where small changes in system parameters produce qualitative changes in behavior, are extraordinarily sensitive to noise. And there is growing evidence that the human brain, especially the prefrontal regions involved in planning and deliberation, operates chronically close to these phase transitions. What this means in practical terms is impressive. In a system near a bifurcation, noise does not just amplify weak signals, it actively explores the state space available to the system. Instead of remaining trapped in a single attractor, in a single stable pattern of activity, noise allows the system to jump between different states, try different activity configurations, explore different potential solutions to the problem it faces. This is extraordinarily useful for a system that needs to be creative, that needs to find new answers to new problems, that cannot simply follow a predetermined script because the environment it faces is too variable for any fixed script to work well. The most visible manifestation of this stochastic amplification process is behavioral variability. And here is something worth pausing to observe carefully, because it is a phenomenon anyone can recognize in their own experience. If you perform the same simple task repeatedly, like pressing a button as fast as possible in response to a visual signal, the time it takes you to respond is not constant. It varies from one attempt to the next, even when you are trying to be as consistent as possible, even when well rested and fully focused. This variability is not random in the sense of being structureless. It has specific statistical properties, mathematical signatures indicating it emerges from a system operating in a criticality regime, near a phase transition. Human reaction times exhibit what mathematicians call power law correlations, meaning slow fluctuations and fast fluctuations coexist in a way no simple white noise model can replicate. It is the signature of a system where the past echoes into the present across vastly different timescales. This variability is not just present in reaction times, it appears in every measurable dimension of human behavior. The amplitude of the movements we make varies from one repetition to the next. The brain's electrical activity patterns, measured by electroencephalography, vary from moment to moment in ways that contain information about the system's state. Even heartbeats, which intuitively seem like they should be regular as a metronome, actually vary in intervals in a way that reflects the health of the autonomic nervous system, with a healthy heart exhibiting more variability, not less, than a heart compromised by disease. Variability in biological systems is often a sign of health and adaptive capacity, not dysfunction. For the topic of free will, the most disturbing and at the same time most fascinating of these discoveries is what happens specifically in the moment preceding a voluntary decision. When a person is about to execute a voluntary movement, like moving a finger or wrist spontaneously without an external triggering signal, the neural activity in the instance preceding the movement is not simply waiting for a conscious decision to form so it can execute it. It is fluctuating. It is exploring the space of possible states. And there is evidence that the exact moment the system commits to a particular state, to the decision to move in one direction rather than another, at one moment rather than another, is determined in part by stochastic fluctuations in neural activity levels. Experiments using high temporal resolution neuroimaging techniques show that activity in the supplementary motor area, the premotor area, and prefrontal regions begins to differ between trials where the person will move their right arm versus their left, up to 10 seconds before the movement. And the direction this activity drifts in those initial instants seems influenced by fluctuations that have no identifiable cause in the external environment. It seems to emerge from within the system itself, from the intrinsic noise of networks that are constantly moving, constantly exploring, never completely at rest. This phenomenon has a second manifestation that is even more directly relevant to the question of free will, impulsivity and behavioral inhibition. The inhibitory control system that allows humans to suppress automatic responses, to resist impulses, to choose not to do something part of the brain is ready to do, involves a dynamic competition between networks promoting action and networks inhibiting it. And this competition is influenced by the level of neural noise. When noise is high, the competition is resolved more quickly, but with less reliability, resulting in more commission errors in actions executed before the inhibitory system has time to intervene. When noise is lower, the competition takes longer to resolve, but inhibition is more likely to be effective when needed. Self-control in this perspective is not a monolithic force will exert over impulses. It is a dynamic balance between competing processes, and neural noise is one of the factors determining which process prevails. There is something that invites a pause here, an observation anyone can make by paying attention to their own experience of making decisions. Think of a moment you were deliberating between two options that seemed almost equally attractive, one dinner or another, a response or silence, advancing or retreating. There was in those moments a sensation of uncertainty that was not simply a lack of information. It was something more visceral, more immediate, as if the system were oscillating between two states, as if the decision had not yet been made by anyone or anything, as if it was suspended in a space of real possibility. What neuroscience suggests is that this sensation is not illusory, in the sense of being an imprecise representation of what is happening in the brain. It may be a quite accurate representation of the actual dynamics of a system in a bifurcation state, actively exploring its options, amplified by noise in a genuinely open space of possibilities. The question this raises is not simple. If the decision is partially determined by stochastic fluctuations, by neural noise that has no identifiable cause, does that make the decision more free or less free? Is randomness the same as freedom? This question will echo in the layers yet to come, but before reaching it, there is something to be observed about the system's current state, about the apparent equilibrium in which the brain seems to operate during the long periods between major decisions. Between bifurcations, between moments of choice that seem truly open, the brain maintains an appearance of stability. Habitual activity patterns sustain themselves. The network's defining personality, values, preferred ways of processing the world continue operating relatively consistently. The person recognizes themselves as the same person as yesterday, a month ago, several years ago. Everyday decisions seem to flow naturally from who one is, from preferences that seem solid and enduring. This equilibrium is real, but it is fragile in ways the system rarely perceives. What sustains this equilibrium is a constellation of factors including sleep, diet, hormonal state, stress levels, recent social interactions, and dozens of other parameters the system rarely monitors consciously. When any of these factors changes sufficiently abruptly, the equilibrium can be broken. The person who thought they knew their own preferences well discovers they act in unexpected ways. The decision that seemed obvious now seems incomprehensible. The self that seemed solid reveals itself to be a configuration sustained by specific conditions and not an essence independent of conditions. And below this apparent equilibrium, the noise continues. The fluctuations continue. The state space continues to be explored silently out of reach of conscious perception by networks that never stop operating. The system is always in motion, always sensitive to perturbations that can be as small as a passing thought, a minimal variation in neurotransmitter levels, a pattern of activity that emerged from interactions between networks and originated from no identifiable brain region. And at some point, these small perturbations can grow, can be amplified by the noise and nonlinearities of the system until a new state becomes possible, until a new bifurcation is reached, until the equilibrium unravels and a new configuration must be found. The system that seems so stable, so predictable, so anchored in a coherent self, is always only momentarily far from its next transformation. There is a threshold the nervous system knows before anything else. It is not a fixed threshold engraved in some anatomical structure as a permanent mark. It is a floating threshold, sensitive to context, sensitive to the organism's internal state, sensitive to the recent activation history of the networks comprising the brain. This threshold is the point where perturbation stops being just noise and begins to be signal, where the fluctuation that seemed insignificant finds the right set of conditions and transforms into something the entire system will need to recognize. This is the moment when calm behavior, that state of relative equilibrium the previous parts described so carefully, begins to yield. And what comes after this yielding is not simply a different state. It is a qualitatively distinct mode of operation, with its own logic, its own speed, its own consequences for what we call decision, will, choice. To understand what makes the system leave calm behavior, we must first recognize that this behavior was never truly quiet. Neural networks operate in a state of permanent tension, a dynamic equilibrium where excitatory and inhibitory forces cancel each other out approximately, never perfectly. Neurons fire, synapses transmit, neurotransmitters are released and reuptaken, and all this happens at a pace that keeps the system functional without letting it explode into uncontrolled activity. This equilibrium is metabolically expensive. The brain consumes a disproportionate fraction of the energy available in the organism, and much of that energy goes exactly into maintaining this state of tensioned readiness. The system is always ready to fire, always sensitive to inputs, always monitoring the internal and external environment for signals that might require a response. What changes when conditions alter is the relative position of this equilibrium. When dopamine levels in the prefrontal cortex rise above a functional range, the capacity to inhibit automatic responses begins to compromise. When the amygdala receives signals it interprets as threatening, even ambiguous signals, even signals the cortex might classify as neutral at another time, it sends projections that alter the readiness state of practically all systems, influencing behavior. When the circadian cycle pushes the organism's physiology into a state of intense wakefulness, or conversely into a state of deep exhaustion, the activation thresholds of entire neuron populations shift, and at some point in this chain of shifts the system crosses a threshold it had not crossed before and begins to organize itself differently. The concept of threshold, when applied to the nervous system in all its complexity, ceases to be the simple image of a switch going from off to on. The threshold of an individual neuron is already more sophisticated than that, sensitive to activation history, to the temporal and spatial sum of inputs, to the state of the membrane potential at a given moment. But the threshold of a network, of a region, of a reentrant circuit connecting structures distributed throughout the entire brain, that threshold is an emergent property of an interaction that cannot be reduced to any of its components. It is a collective threshold, a transition point the system as a whole crosses, and that once crossed changes the dynamics in a way not easily reversed by simply removing the original perturbation. This is what mathematicians call a bifurcation, and what neuroscientists observe in the data when a subject experiences something that transforms their brain activity pattern durably. The perturbation does not need to be large to produce a bifurcation. What determines whether a perturbation will lead to a bifurcation or be simply absorbed by the system is the system's position relative to its threshold at the moment the perturbation arrives. A system far from the threshold can absorb considerable perturbations without changing state. A system near the threshold can be traversed by a tiny perturbation, a word spoken at the wrong time, a memory evoked by a smell, a variation in cortisol level no external instrument could detect, and be launched into a completely different trajectory. Humanity has observed these phenomena for a long time, even before having any language to describe them in terms of nonlinear dynamics or complex systems. Traditions that try to map altered states of human experience, moments of sudden insight, religious conversion crises, flow states where time perception dissolves, decisions that seem to come from somewhere beyond conscious deliberation. All these traditions were trying to name exactly this phenomenon. They were trying to describe what happens when the system crosses a threshold and begins operating in a mode the very person experiencing it cannot recognize as continuous with who they were before. Contemporary neuroscience has begun measuring these phenomena with a precision traditions lacked, and what it finds confirms and simultaneously complicates what subjective experience always suggested. The electroencephalograms of people in deep meditation states show synchronization patterns between regions that rarely synchronize in ordinary waking states. The magnetic resonances of people during creative insight episodes show a reorganization of activity preceding the conscious moment of understanding by several seconds, sometimes much longer. Functional connectivity measurements in people under the influence of psychedelic substances show a collapse of normal communication hierarchies between regions and an explosion of connections between areas that usually do not talk to each other, a phenomenon researchers have called neural entropy. and which seems to correspond exactly to what would be expected of a system pushed far from its usual equilibrium state and exploring a much larger state space. Predicting when a nervous system will cross one of these thresholds is one of the most difficult ambitions in neuroscience. The problem is not a lack of data. Modern instruments generate amounts of data about brain activity that would be impossible to process without machine learning algorithms. The problem is that the markers preceding a state transition are often subtle, distributed across many variables simultaneously, and only appear clearly predictive in retrospect. The phenomenon mathematicians call critical slowing down, a sort of critical slowness in the system's recovery after small perturbations, has been identified as a possible marker of proximity to a threshold in systems ranging from ecosystems to financial markets, and researchers have begun looking for analogous signals in brain activity data. The idea is that a system approaching a bifurcation begins taking longer to return to its usual state after being perturbed, as if the basin of attraction were becoming shallower, less capable of pulling the system back to the center. Detecting this signal in the noise of neural activity is an extraordinarily delicate task. The most dramatic phenomena emerging when the system enters intense mode are not necessarily the most violent. The decision state subjects describe as overwhelming those choices that seem to have been made by something deeper than conscious deliberation, the moments when a person suddenly knows what they will do before having formulated any conscious argument for it. These moments are often accompanied by a quality of clarity that is the opposite of disorder. The system is not in chaos. The system has found a configuration that is much more stable than the preceding state of deliberation, and consciousness experiences this as certainty, as resolution, as the feeling that the choice was always inevitable. What Libet's experiments and their successors showed, and what more recent research has confirmed with greater temporal and spatial resolution, is that this certainty arrives in consciousness after the system has already organized itself around a trajectory. Subjective clarity is not the cause of the organization, it is the consequence of it. This does not mean conscious experience is irrelevant. It means it is a functional component of a much larger system, a component that plays a real role in the system's dynamics, but that does not occupy the place of causal origin common intuition attributes to it. Consciousness can influence the system's state by feeding back into the preparation process that preceded it. It can signal to the networks monitoring the organism's own behavior that a configuration has been reached, triggering consolidation processes that will make that configuration more likely in the future. It can, in some cases, activate inhibitory circuits that perturb a trajectory already underway, producing what some experience as containment, as the exercise of something resembling resistance to an impulse. But in all these cases, what is happening is an interaction between components of a distributed system, not the act of a unitary agency situated above or outside that system. The structures the system generates when operating in intense mode tend to be persistent in a way calm equilibrium states rarely are. A decision made in a state of high emotional activation leaves traces the nervous system will carry much longer than an equivalent decision made in a state of calm deliberation. Memories formed in states of high arousal have a different quality, are encoded with greater intensity, consolidated more efficiently, more resistant to forgetting and subsequent updating. This is not accidental. It is a functional characteristic of a system that evolved to give special weight to events occurring when the stakes were high, when the organism was mobilized, when crossing that specific threshold had some consequence for survival or social functioning. While you rest, somewhere at this very moment a nervous system is crossing one of these thresholds. Not metaphorically, not approximately. A brain in some city, in some room, in some moment of silence or noise is at the exact point of a bifurcation. It is at the instant where noise has become sufficient signal, where the perturbation found the system in the right position, where the basin of attraction could no longer pull the trajectory back to the center. And a new configuration is emerging. A new stability is being found. A new trajectory is being inscribed in the connection patterns that will determine what that system will do next, and then after that. And that person, upon awakening from this moment, will have the experience of having decided, of having chosen, of having exercised what they call will. And that experience will not be false. It will be the faithful representation, from consciousness's point of view, of something that indeed happened. But what happened was not exactly what the experience suggests. The intense mode is not a deviation from the norm. It is the mechanism by which the system reconfigures itself. It is the process by which the brain does what needs to be done when the usual equilibrium is no longer sufficient to handle what the environment or internal state is demanding. And every time this process completes, it leaves the system slightly different than it was before. Connections have been strengthened or weakened. Thresholds have been recalibrated. The state space has been remapped. The system that emerged from the bifurcation is not exactly the same as the one that entered it. And this that changes, this transformation that happens through the intense mode, does not happen in isolation. The transformation that happens inside the skull never happens alone. The brain is not an island. It is a node within a much larger network, and the signals arriving and leaving it every instant carry enough information to alter the state of the entire system to which it belongs. The most intimate partner of this node, the system with which the brain exchanges energy most constantly and deeply, is the very body that sustains it. Not the body as an abstract concept, but the body as a set of organs, tissues, fluids, and rhythms operating in parallel with neural processing, influencing it with every heartbeat, every intestinal contraction, every variation in the chemical composition of the blood crossing the cerebral arteries. This relationship between the brain and the rest of the organism is much more intimate than classical neuroscience supposed. For decades, the dominant model treated the brain as the command center sending orders to the periphery. The heart pumped because the brain allowed it. The lungs expanded because the brainstem signaled it. The stomach digested because the autonomic nervous system orchestrated it. But this hierarchical model has been progressively replaced by a more symmetrical understanding. The heart sends about 40,000 afferent neurons to the brain, fibers conducting signals from the heart toward the cortex, not the other way around. The intestine contains its own neural network with a quantity of neurons comparable to certain regions of the brain itself, and this network communicates with the central nervous system via the vagus nerve bidirectionally, in a proportion that surprises. Most vagus nerve fibers conduct information from the intestine to the brain, not from the brain to the intestine. This means that what the body feels, literally feels in the physiological sense, reaches the brain before the brain has time to formulate any conscious interpretation. The visceral state precedes the conscious perception of that state, and when the brain tries to evaluate a situation, take a direction, configure a response, it is doing so from a substrate already partially shaped by what the body is experiencing at that moment, the heart rate acceleration preceding the perception of danger, the intestinal contraction preceding the consciousness of anxiety, the diffuse sensation of well-being emerging from the release of certain compounds by the digestive system before any thought about well-being has formed. The feedback loops between these two systems, the brain and the body, operate on multiple temporal scales simultaneously. On the millisecond scale, the autonomic nervous system is constantly adjusting heart rate, blood pressure, pupil dilation, gland activity in response to signals arriving from all directions. In that same fraction of a second, the brain is receiving back the result of these adjustments, incorporating this information into the continuous updating of its internal model of the organism's state. In seconds, limbic system circuits are integrating this information with recent memories and relevance assessments, generating the emotional states that will color all subsequent perception. In minutes, the axis connecting the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal glands is releasing or suppressing hormones that alter receptor sensitivity throughout the body, including in the brain itself. In hours, these hormones are influencing gene expression in specific neurons, modulating which proteins will be produced, which synapses strengthened, which circuits will gain or lose influence over future behavior. There is a set of data illustrating this feedback particularly clearly. Studies tracking populations over decades found that heart rate variability patterns, a measure of how flexibly the cardiovascular system responds to different demands, predict with statistical significance the central nervous system's capacity to regulate emotions and make decisions under pressure. People whose hearts maintain high variability tend to show greater cognitive flexibility, better impulse inhibition capacity, greater ease in redirecting attention. And this cardiac variability in turn is influenced by breathing patterns, sleep quality, nutritional state, physical activity level. The cycle closes. What the body does with its own basic functioning directly feeds back into the circuits the brain will later use to make what it will call decisions. In the short term, this feedback system operates as a stabilization mechanism. The organism tends to return to states it recognizes as safe, to patterns that have been successful in maintaining equilibrium. When something disturbs this equilibrium, the cascade of responses triggered most frequently results in restoring something close to the previous state. The system resists change because change, from the point of view of an organism evolved to survive, carries risk. The unknown can be more dangerous than the familiar, and so the brain, in collaboration with the body, tends to replicate patterns that have already worked, to follow routes already travelled, to interpret new situations through the lenses of old experiences. But in the long term, over decades of a life, the system accumulates the small modifications each bifurcation leaves as a legacy. Transformations that seem imperceptible in a day become unmistakable when viewed through years. The person an 8-year-old child will become at 40 carries in their neural circuits the compressed history of thousands of moments when the system was perturbed and found a new equilibrium. Every relationship formed and lost, every skill learned and practiced until it became automatic, every belief adopted, contested, abandoned, or deepened. All this is inscribed not as declarative memory, not as narrative that can be conscious, but as the current configuration of synaptic weights, firing thresholds, activation patterns that constitute what that person, at that moment, will call themselves. And when we look at even larger scales, at centuries of human history, what we see is this process manifesting at the collective level. Cultures are, in a way, extensions of individual processing systems. Social norms are learned patterns selected over generations because they reduced the cognitive cost of coordinating behaviors in groups. Religious rituals and spiritual practices are technologies developed over millennia to induce brain states the group valued. Legal systems are external codifications of moral judgments that, internally, each brain needs to make much faster and with much less information. Culture is not something existing outside the brain. It is something the brain collectively built, and that now helps build the brain, generation after generation, in a feedback loop operating on the scale of centuries. When the scale expands to millions of years, what emerges is the evolutionary perspective, and it completely transforms what seems to be the central problem of this reflection. The question of whether we choose or do not choose, of whether there is something like freedom, or if everything is determined, takes on a completely different form when viewed through the deep time of evolution. The neural mechanisms making possible what we live as deliberation, as weighing alternatives, as the capacity to delay gratification and anticipate consequences. These mechanisms did not arise by accident. They were selected because organisms possessing them survived and reproduced more successfully than organisms lacking them. The behavioral flexibility they confer has adaptive value. In variable and unpredictable environments, a system that can modify its own behavior based on anticipated consequences is much more robust than a system responding only to immediate stimuli. But there is here a sensitivity to initial conditions imposing radical limits on any pretension of prediction. In systems like the brain, where billions of elements interact on multiple temporal scales with constant feedback, small differences in initial conditions produce radically different trajectories. A single childhood experience, of little apparent importance at the moment it occurred, may have modified the sensitivity of a specific circuit enough to alter the entire subsequent developmental trajectory. A single encounter, a single phrase heard at the right time, a single moment of attention or abandonment may have been the bifurcation point from which two paths separated irreversibly. This is the fundamental limit of human prediction, not just from a practical point of view, but from a point of principle. Even if we knew with absolute perfection the state of every synapse in a brain at a given moment, even if we had infinite computational capacity to simulate all subsequent interactions, the system's sensitivity to perturbations arriving from the environment would make long-term prediction impossible. The brain is an open system. It continuously exchanges energy and information with the world around it. And the world around it is also a complex system whose evolution depends on initial conditions with infinite resolution. There is something inviting silent contemplation at this point. Not frustration, not resignation, but a particular form of wonder. The brain is a system that evolved over hundreds of millions of years to solve an extraordinarily difficult problem. How can an organism persist, thrive, and reproduce in an environment that is both regularly predictable and intermittently unpredictable? The solution evolution found combines stability with flexibility, economy with rearrangement capacity, automatic processing speed with the possibility in special circumstances of deep reconfiguration. And what emerges from this solution is something the system itself calls experience. The internal texture of what it is to be an organism with this type of brain. The sensation that things matter, that some directions are better than others, that there is a self persisting through time and acting as the agent of the actions the body executes. This experience is not an epiphenomenon. It is not an illusion in the sense of something that does not exist. It is what the system looks like to itself when looking inward, and what the system looks like to itself has real consequences on how it functions. The narrative the brain builds about itself feeds back into the very system that generated it. What makes this process both comprehensible and inexhaustible is that it can be described in physical, chemical, biological, and computational terms, without that description exhausting what there is to be understood about it. The equations describing the dynamics of an action potential are complete within their domain of validity. The models describing neural network activity capture real patterns and make testable predictions. And at the same time, when that person who was in intense mode emerges from the bifurcation and has the experience of having decided something happened that the equations describe but do not exhaust, there is behind all this complexity something that persists through all scales, from the millisecond to the million years, from the individual neuron to the collective culture, something not lost in mechanistic descriptions nor in phenomenological descriptions. Something present both when the system operates in automatic mode and when it reconfigures in bifurcations. A fundamental property not visible in any of the isolated parts, but that emerges from how the whole organizes itself, and that may be the key to understanding what it really means for a system like this to exist in time. There is a property the nervous system exhibits in all its manifestations, a property appearing in no isolated equation but crossing every level of organization like an invisible guiding thread. This property is the capacity to fold back upon itself, to take its own activity as an object, to represent the current state and compare it with possible states that do not yet exist. It is this reflexive fold that makes the system different from any other known physical system. A stone falls because gravity pulls it. A neuron fires because the potential difference exceeded a threshold. But the set of neurons forming a human mind does something different. It simulates the stone falling before it falls. It represents the firing before it happens. It inhabits the future while still in the present. This capacity for prospective simulation is what is at stake when we talk about free will. It is not about an ethereal soul escaping physical laws. It is about an extraordinarily sophisticated physical mechanism using the past stored as memory to construct virtual versions of the future, compare them, assign values to each, and orient present activity toward the versions the system judges most compatible with its own survival, coherence, and flourishing. What we call choice is the process by which this simulation resolves into a specific direction, What we call agency is the property of a system actively participating in this resolution. The feedback loops sustaining this process operate in layers. There are feedback loops that amplify, those taking a weak signal and making it dominant. When a line of reasoning begins gaining support from multiple brain regions simultaneously, when the prefrontal cortex and limbic system and cerebellum begin converging in the same direction, this convergence self-amplifies. Each region aligning reinforces the signal for the others, and what was one possibility among many becomes progressively more likely until it becomes inevitable, until thought crystallizes into intention, and intention crystallizes into act. This amplification process is what we experience as the moment the decision clarifies, when suddenly we know what we will do. But there are also feedback loops that stabilize, that resist change, that preserve established patterns against perturbations. The habit systems in the striatum are profoundly stabilizing. Once a behavioral pattern has been executed enough times, the connections supporting it become extraordinarily robust. The system resists change not by passive inertia, but by an active process of constant reinforcement. Every time the habit is executed, it strengthens. Every time it is suppressed with effort, it exerts a return tension. This tension is what we feel when trying to break an old pattern, that sensation of swimming against a current that seems larger than us. The interaction between amplification and stabilization is what gives the nervous system its characteristic temporal texture. We are simultaneously creatures of habit and creatures of change, systems that preserve and systems that renew. The balance between these two forces is not fixed but dynamic, varying throughout life, throughout the day, throughout distinct emotional states. In moments of high plasticity, like childhood, like states of intense learning, like periods of deep personal transformation, amplification forces gain advantage over stabilization ones. The system opens to new configurations. In moments of consolidation, of maturity, of established routine, stabilizing forces predominate. The system preserves what it has learned. The molecular dimension of this process is even more vertiginous. At the level of proteins and signaling molecules, the decision seeming to happen in a second is being prepared by processes taking hours, days, weeks. When a glutamate receptor is repeatedly activated, it triggers a chemical cascade eventually reaching the neuron's nucleus, where specific genes are activated, where new proteins are synthesized, where the physical structure of the synapse is literally remodeled. What we call learning is the physical memory of past encounters inscribed in the molecular architecture of present connections. The signaling molecules mediating these changes have names sounding technical, but describing processes of singular beauty. Protein kinase C, which phosphorylates receptors and changes their sensitivity. Brain-derived growth factor, which protects neurons and promotes new connection growth. Synaptobrevin and syntaxin, proteins wrapping around each other like molecular zippers to fuse vesicles with the membrane and release neurotransmitters. Each of these proteins was shaped by hundreds of millions of years of evolution to do exactly what it does, with a precision no human engineering has yet replicated. And beneath the proteins, the lipids of the neuronal membrane form a fluid, heterogeneous environment-modulating channel and receptor activity in ways we are still discovering. Water molecules filling the intracellular space participate in hydrogen networks, transferring information on femtosecond-time scales so fast they are comparable to electron movement. Nervous system activity, when observed in its finest molecular dimension, reveals that the distinction between chemistry and information dissolves. Information is not transported by chemistry. Information is the chemistry, organized in specific forms, operating in specific sequences, in specific contexts. Viewed as an integrated system, the question of free will reveals itself as the question of how a material system can be the author of its own future states. Classical physics would say this is impossible, that future states are determined by present states by the laws of nature, with no room for authorship. Quantum mechanics introduces indeterminism but does not solve the problem, because random indeterminism is not the same as intentional authorship. What systems neuroscience is beginning to suggest is that there is a third possibility, that sufficiently complex systems can exercise a form of causality that is neither classical determinism nor quantum randomness. This third possibility has been called different names by different researchers. Some speak of strong emergence, the idea that genuinely new properties arise at higher levels of organization not reducible to lower level properties. Others speak of downward causation, the idea that higher level patterns can exert causal influence on lower level components. Others still prefer to speak of nested feedback systems creating a type of self-reference with no analogue in simpler systems. The vocabulary varies, but the phenomenon each of these terms points to is the same, that the whole can do things the parts cannot, and that this capacity of the whole is physical, real, and causally efficacious. The complex patterns emerging from the nervous system from relatively simple rules are one of the most extraordinary phenomena nature exhibits. Each neuron follows simple local rules: integrate inputs, fire if threshold is reached, modify connections according to correlated activity. There is no central neuron coordinating the process, no conductor reading the full score, and yet, from the interaction of billions of units following these local rules, emerges the capacity to recognize a face in a fraction of a second, to understand the structure of a poem, to feel the longing for someone no longer here, to plan an action only to be realized in years. This emergence is not magic, but neither is it trivial. It is the result of a specific organization, of an architecture developed over a long, rugged evolutionary history, and that develops again in each individual over years of growth, learning, and experience. Emergence does not arise from any combination of neurons, just as liquidity does not arise from any combination of molecules. It requires the right relations, the right scales, the right history. Deep down, free will is simply the property of a system that has become sufficiently complex to be the cause of itself within the limits of what is physically possible. Not a cause escaping the laws of nature, but a cause the laws of nature made possible by creating systems capable of modelling the future, of evaluating possibilities, of reorganizing in response to internal values. Every element we have traversed throughout these nights connects to this central idea. Libet's experiment, which seemed to demonstrate consciousness arrives too late to cause action, actually demonstrates the system operates on multiple simultaneous timescales, and that the time of conscious experience is just one of the times in which the system exists. The readiness potential forming before the consciousness of intention is not proof we are not free. It is proof that freedom operates on broader temporal scales than that of the single moment of decision. Freedom is in the complete pattern, not in the instant. The attention mechanisms filtering reality, amplifying certain signals and suppressing others, are the concrete expression of the system organizing itself according to its own internal priorities. When we direct attention, we are literally shaping the reality the system will process, and this shaping has real causal consequences on what the system will do next. Attention is a form of freedom completely consistent with the system's physics, synaptic plasticity, allowing the system to modify itself in response to experience, is the mechanism by which the past becomes destiny without destiny being necessary. We are shaped by what we live, but we are not determined by it in a closed way, because every new experience offers the possibility of a new configuration. History forms us, and we participate in this formation, which means we participate in the formation of ourselves. Bifurcations in system states, those moments when small differences produce large consequences, are the points where agency manifests most visibly. In these moments, the system is genuinely open to multiple futures, and what determines which future realizes is the complete internal state of the system, including its values, its history, its attention, its mood, its fatigue, its hopes. This complete internal state is what we are, and what we are is what decides. The evolutionary dimension reminds us this capacity did not arise from nowhere, but is the product of a process lasting hundreds of millions of years, that tested countless variations, that preserved what worked and discarded what did not. We are the result of a cosmic scale optimization experiment, and the capacity we call free will is one of the most sophisticated solutions this experiment found for the problem of how to navigate an unpredictable environment. The system is always active, even now. Even as thoughts begin to drift from rigor and clarity, even as attention begins to dissolve at the edges of sleep, the fundamental processes continue. The heart beats at a rhythm, the autonomic nervous system modulates without any conscious instruction. Breathing rises and falls with a regularity established long before any thought about it. Memory consolidation systems begin to work, organizing what was learned today, transferring patterns from the hippocampus to the cortex, preparing the system for tomorrow. You're safe now. The system that has navigated bifurcations and built possible futures all your life can rest for a few hours. Decisions can wait. Values are intact. The history that brought you here remains, and it does not disappear in sleep. It deepens, it integrates, it becomes more fully yours. The universe takes care of you, not as a separate entity looking from outside, but as the context within which you exist, as the fabric you're made of, as the process of which you are a local, temporary and precious expression. Everything is in order on the scale that matters. The stars continue in their orbits, tectonic plates continue their slow movement, oceans continue their tidal breathing. While you rest, free will continues being what it always was. The way this specific system, with this specific history, with these specific values, navigates the space of possibilities the world offers. It does not disappear in sleep, it simply waits, like a capacity that does not need to be exercised to exist. You are part of this. You always have been. Part of the process that began with the first molecules capable of replicating, that passed through the first organisms with primitive nervous systems, that arrived here, to this night, to this moment of rest after a day of navigation. Synapses gradually quiet down. Brainwaves become slower, broader, softer. Thoughts lose their defined edges. You are safe. The universe takes care of you. Everything's in order. Free will rests alongside you. Consciousness gently dissolves. Like mist at dawn, you're real. You matter. You belong to this world. Sleep now. The universe continues its silent dance, and we rest in its embrace. Thank you for walking with me tonight. Sleep well.